It was October 4th, 1957, when history was forever changed.
Almost all of America was engulfed in the World Series featuring the New York Yankees and the Milwaukee Braves.
American lives were normal as parents worked and children attended school.
Families sat down for dinner together every night.
They even had annual game nights.
The Soviet Union initiated the space age with the launch of Sputnik, which was the world's first artificial satellite. The satellite launched at 10:29 p.m. Moscow time from the Tyuratam launch base.
The satellite was about the size of a beach ball, with a diameter of 22.8 inches and a weight of 183.9 pounds. Sputnik took roughly 98 minutes to orbit the Earth on its elliptical path.
Immediately after the Sputnik 1 launch, the U.S. Defense Department approved funding for another U.S. satellite project.
As an alternative to Vanguard, Wernher von Braun and his team began to work on the Explorer project, and on January 31, 1958, the United States successfully launched Explorer 1.
This satellite discovered the magnetic radiation belts around the Earth and was named after principal investigator James Van Allen. The Explorer program was a successful, although it may not seem like it, series of lightweight scientific spacecraft.
In 1959, the Soviet space program launched Luna 2, which was the first space probe to hit the moon.
In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth, traveling in a capsule-like spacecraft named Vostok 1.
Project Mercury began after the U.S. sent a man into space. This is where NASA engineers designed a smaller, cone-shaped capsule that they tested with chimpanzees and held a final test in March 1961 before the Soviets were able to pull ahead with Gagarin's launch.
On May 5th, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, not in orbit. Later that May, President John F. Kennedy made a statement saying that the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth, and by the end of that year, the foundations of NASA's lunar landing program, which started Project Apollo, were in place.
In January of 1967, Apollo faced a setback when 3 astronauts were killed in a fire when their spacecraft broke out in flames during a launch simulation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's lunar landing program proceeded slowly, partly due to the death of Sergei Korolev, chief engineer of the Soviet space program.
In December 1968, Apollo 8 was launched, and it was the first manned space mission to orbit the moon. It was launched on NASA's facility on Merritt Island in Florida. On July 16, 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on the Apollo 11 space mission, the first lunar landing attempt.
Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon's surface. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. By landing on the moon's surface, the United States ultimately won the space race that had begun with the launch of Sputnik in 1957.
The American public was enchanted by the space race, and the developments were heavily covered in the national media. Millions of American families gathered nightly to watch the developments in the race. Astronauts became the image of the ultimate American heroes. Americans saw the Soviets as villains with their persistent efforts to surpass the Americans and prove the power of communism.
Citizens in America became infused with nationalism and pride for their country. and even began to make homemade rockets to launch into space in order to get ahead of the Soviets in the race.
Congress allowed a massive increase in the funding of science, math, and engineering education, and would receive more than $1 billion in a funding increase. National scholarships were announced, and money was flowing into universities for the purpose of students getting a better education to pull ahead in the space race. Education was believed to be critical in our national defense.
During the years of 1961 to 1964, NASA's budget was increased by almost 500%, and the lunar landing program provided almost 34,000 NASA employees and 375,000 employees of industrial and university contractors. From 1961 through the first lunar landing in July 1969, NASA spent about $23 billion on manned programs.
Toward the end of President Kennedy's life, he feared that the space race was losing its glamour. He hoped that the Soviets would better their efforts and once re-excite the American public and their interest in the space race. He was afraid the citizens of America would only see the space program as a waste of money.
ASA and its sister institution, which was the Advanced Research Project Agency, were the results of Eisenhower trying to maintain the United States military and space superiority, and the final one being the space race.
Prior to the launching of Sputnik 1, there was a very general belief from the world that the Soviet Union was a long way from offering a serious challenge to the U.S. lead in science, technology, and productive power. Sputnik and other Soviet space achievements appeared as a dramatic demonstration that the USSR was able to challenge the U.S.
Sputnik worked a major modification in the world image of the USSR. Their technological advancements appeared to close the gap between the US and the USSR in terms of relative power, and gave new dimensions and new worries to that power, a fact which the USSR has exploited in its propaganda and diplomacy, with greatly increased credibility.
With the Gemini and Apollo programs, the U.S. had taken a huge lead in the space race. In July of 1975, with the relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union beginning to thaw, the first U.S.-Soviet joint mission occurred with the Apollo-Soyuz project. The space race was effectively over.